Today on the Stone Chapel podcast, the humble skeptic. Who is the humble skeptic, you ask? Well, if you don't know, you're about to find out. But first, I'm David Capes. The Stone Chapel podcast is part of the Church Leaders Podcast Network. We're dedicated to providing resources for church leaders to help them navigate the complexities of ministry. You can learn more about that at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast network. If you haven't heard the Humble Skeptic podcast, you need to. Its production value is off the charts. Shane Rosenthal, the talent and the writer behind it, he's brilliant. He has an amazing story you're about to hear. So with no further ado, the Humble Skeptic, Shane Rosenthal, is here today on the Stone Chapel podcast.
My name is Shane Rosenthal, and I was raised in a secular Jewish home and became an atheist at a very young age. But soon after that, in my college years, I ended up losing faith in atheism, and I converted to Christianity.
Shane Rosenthal, the humble skeptic. Welcome to the Stone Chapel podcast.
It's great to be with you, David.
It's great to see you. I saw you and your wife at the Lanier Theological Library recently, and that was marvelous. I really enjoyed it. Gary Habermas was our lecturer that weekend, and we had a great time.
Yeah, I really enjoyed being there. Thanks for the invitation. My wife and I just really enjoyed our time there. It was our first time at the library.
Well, we got to get you back for lots and lots of reasons. We're going to talk today about your persona as the humble skeptic. I guess you're proud of that, right?
You know, I was shopping around different ideas when I decided to start my own podcast, and I was wondering, would this work in a Christian world? Because, you'd think of the word skeptic in the outside. That's the unbeliever's language.
That's the guy that's questioning everything. Right?
Yeah. It's actually done very well in Christian audiences. And the way I like to say it is that we're all believers, but we can't all be right, because we have so many different disagreements with what we believe. And every doubter is also a believer, and every believer is also a doubter. I mean, when the Jehovah's Witnesses come to your door, you don't believe them.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And so we're all believers and skeptics, but we kind of simplify things when we talk about believing in skepticism and all that stuff. So I just say, I want to own skepticism, but in a humble way. So I want us to be discerning is another way to put it.
I love that. Now, earlier you said that you were raised in a secular Jewish home and that you lost faith in your atheism. Unpack a little bit of that. In other words, sort of who is Shane Rosenthal here, the humble skeptic?
Part of the issue of my own upbringing is what I like to focus on throughout the rest of your life. We're all struggling with things that happened to us in our formative years, but I was raised in a secular Jewish home that we didn't have a lot of theological discussions, biblical discussions. That was kind of like the thing you study at Hebrew school, and it was compartmentalized, and it was liturgical, traditional, but not a lot of substance. And I checked out as a third grader. I just thought it was made up and silly, but I didn't vocalize my doubts. So I think that's important. As Christians, as we think about how we are nurturing others in the faith, we should make sure we're weaving in to our theology and doctrine, this is actually touching the real world. This is true for everyone, not just us. That's what we believe, actually, about our core doctrines. This is true, and here's why we believe it's true. For me, I began doubting that this was real. I thought, the stories are fictional. But the thing that rescued me from my atheism was actually bumping into some of these messianic prophecies, like Micah 5:2, Isaiah 53. So out of Bethlehem, the Messiah will come. The Messiah will be a suffering servant, and he will atone for sin. All those great themes that Paul summarizes in 1 Corinthians 15, according to the scriptures. This is seen by eyewitnesses, but foreseen by the prophets. So that rattled my world, as it were, and I started talking to rabbis about it.
What did they say about it?
My favorite is one of the rabbis when I mentioned Psalm 22. Here it says, they've pierced my hands and my feet. Doesn't that sound like crucifixion? He said, I don't know. Bows and arrows?
Could be a lot of things, right?
Could be bows and arrows. And I mentioned Micah 5:2, and he said, well, that's not really talking about the Messiah who's going to be born in Bethlehem. It's talking about King David, who is related to the Messiah, and King David was born in Bethlehem. And I asked him at the time, and I'd only been a Christian, I don't know, for about a few months. I said, how do you know, like if somebody today comes and claims to be the Messiah, how are you going to find out that he's related to King David? I mean, aren't the records all destroyed, after the fall of Jerusalem? And he said, that's a good problem.
You said you were about in third grade when you became...
Third grade when I became an atheist.
Atheist, okay. Did you tell your parents about this, or did you tell your rabbi?
When I converted, I did not vocalize my doubts as an atheist. It's all in my head. I'm just kind of going through the motions. The reason why I could do that is because we didn't really talk about religion at home. It was more of a traditional culture, diet, festivals, but not a lot of theology or biblical discussions. So
Yeah.
it's easy to be sort of anonymous there.
It was interesting that you said to me earlier that you lost your faith in atheism, because people don't often think of atheism as a faith.
Yeah, and I make the point that faith isn't a religious term, especially if you look at the word that's used in the New Testament. It's not a particularly religious word. It's just the word trust. What do we trust? What do we believe? What do we know? We should be humble about these things. And if you just think about chance, there are thousands of different worldviews out there. Your view isn't likely to be right. So you need something better than just chance and odds. And that's why we should think things through carefully. The reason I converted to Christianity is I became convinced that, wait a minute, there's something here that's substantive, that's grounded, that seems like obvious that this is the true faith. It was revealed in advance.
So earlier you said you bumped into messianic prophecies. How did that happen?
I was just out of high school and I began working in various restaurants. Conversations started with people I was working with. They invited me to church. I experimented one day and I said yes, and I went to one. But also things I was hearing in college piqued my interest. I began reading. I don't know why I was reading in the book of Micah, but that was the first one, where I saw the Bethlehem word. I actually went to my closet and pulled out an old Hebrew Bible where it's Hebrew on one side and English on the other.
Sure,
I'd been to Hebrew school, bar mitzvah, and I looked like it can't really say Bethlehem here. It's right there, because I'd seen the Christmas specials. And if you follow that passage too, it says, out of Bethlehem shall come the one whose origins are from old, from everlasting. And a couple verses later, his name will be great to the ends of the earth. If you think about it, like who else from Bethlehem has a name that everyone knows?
Yeah.
I mean, according to many stats, Jesus is the most famous person who ever lived.
Yeah, exactly. You have this persona. Let's transition a little bit here. And your website is called The Humble Skeptic. I love that. And it's all kinds of really wonderful, well-produced podcasts that are just beautifully done. You weave music and you tell stories. It's just phenomenal. It's more than just a podcast. It's something else.
My name is Shane Rosenthal. I was raised in a Jewish home, but became an atheist at a very young age. Later, as I began to question things, I ended up losing faith in my atheism and converted to Christianity. Since that time, I've never stopped asking questions, and I've spoken with authors and scholars from all over the world in order to explore the beliefs and ideas that shape our lives.
And you started this because you've been in radio for quite a while.
Yeah, about 3 decades. I started with a guy named Michael Horton. I don't know if you know that name.
Oh, yeah.
He's a theologian at Westminster Seminary. He and I had the idea to kind of create a theological talk show back in 1990. Wrote some grant proposals, got some funding, created this show called The White Horse Inn. That was 34 years ago. But so I was involved as the producer of that show for most of those decades. And then for 3 years in there, I also hosted that show. What it did is it gave me access to theologians from all over the world. So I got to meet R.C. Sproul's and the Jim Boyces and Richard Bauckham and D.A. Carson. Recording interviews, hanging out with them. We used to have them come out and speak at various conferences, but we get to talk with them informally afterwards. And so there's just a great way to pick the minds of the best thinkers around the Christian world, really.
That's one of the great things about the Lanier Theological Library. We bring some of the best thinkers and idea people in the world, and we have a chance to sit down with them often, and like yourself, just ask questions. What would you say the mission of the Humble Skeptic is? What are you really up to? What are you trying to accomplish?
My main goal is to inspire curiosity. What I want is for people to begin to be curious and even unsettling them. This is one thing I do when I have the opportunity to talk to kids. I'll spend time trying to pique their interest by saying, hey, here's what Bart Ehrman says. What are we going to do with that? Because they have to know these things before they get into the college classroom where they can really be rattled. We need to discuss these important issues. Inspiring curiosity, I mean, if you just think about it, the way we interpret the Bible, there may be a room with 100 Christians, but when you take a certain biblical text, there may be 4 or 5 different interpretive options just with this small group of people. And, there again, you can't just say, well, I am going to go with the interpretation that I'm comfortable with, that I was raised with. That's part of my tradition. The question is, why do you think your tradition's interpretation is the right one? When you get curious and you start digging into these things, man, I just think you bump into all kinds of interesting things. And you find things you've never noticed before. It's another way of trying to remove our baggage as 21st century Christians and to get enter the first century world. When you get deeply seated in that world, man, it's very interesting. And all the stuff that's happening with Jesus, what he says, when you understand its context with the Old Testament, that's something that's dear to your heart.
Yes,
you wrote a commentary on Matthew related to that. That is, it explodes, and then you really begin to understand the significance of the things that Jesus says and why it's so profound.
You've created this persona, you've created this idea, and asking curious questions. And one of the things I love is this thing that you find on your merch. It's a motto: truth isn't afraid of questions. How did you come to that?
As I was wrestling with issues of faith and doubt, there are a lot of people who just really think of faith as this kind of blind leap. That's something I discussed on the first year of my podcast, almost every episode. And if you think of faith as a blind leap, one of the things that I do a lot is man on the street interviews. And so I've asked a lot of people, what do you think of faith? Well, it's not something that you can prove. It's kind of a blind leap. Then I'll follow that question up with, so why did you take this blind leap here in this direction as opposed to over here in this other direction, say with another holy book or another religion or no religion at all? And often they just don't know how to answer that question. What I think is super important is that the questions get to what our ultimate convictions rely on. And if you're doubting your faith and you start asking questions, a lot of people think that's a bad thing, that they shouldn't ask questions. That gets scary. And if you look through the text, there are places where John the Baptist was asking questions, go ask Jesus. Is he really the one? And he's the guy that preached the sermon, like, behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world.
Is there another guy coming that we should expect?
He'd be doubting the words of his own sermon.
Sure.
But Jesus doesn't scold him for asking that question. In fact, you look at that carefully. I think it's Luke 7 and Matthew. It seems that Jesus gives him evidence. Go tell him what you've seen.
Absolutely.
So he's providing John with evidence from eyewitnesses and how the language he stated matches the Old Testament prophets.
And when you look at the Psalms are full of questions. You look at the laments, they're full of questions. You look at the book of Job, full of questions. And yet we are of the opinion that we shouldn't ask these deep, theological, troubling, personal, sometimes spiritual questions. It seems odd to me that we have come to that point.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Psalms in particular, where are you, God? Are you sleeping? Those kinds of questions, if you were to utter that in church, I mean, it could cause a stir.
Sure.
I just think getting back to what the biblical text is, it just allows room for those kinds of questions, even from a person who's really struggling and doesn't even know if God's listening. It should all be on the table. The particular approach that I take is just the kind of approach that was there in the New Testament era. Paul didn't mind people questioning his apostolic authority. He actually says to the Bereans, or Luke says, that when the Bereans asked and checked Paul to see whether the things he was saying were really what the Old Testament was saying, they were to be commended for that. And so we shouldn't have any trouble questioning things. Paul says, test all things.
Yeah, I love that. I haven't really thought about it in those terms. Yeah, but I like that. About the Bereans, that's terrific. What kind of responses do you get from listeners? Do they contact you? Are you just hoping that it's having an effect? How does that work?
I'm getting really good response. I get questions from people who do struggle with issues related to their faith. I got a question recently about, can we even trust the story of Jesus' birth? Trouble about Quirinius. So I want to do a whole series related to that. The next time Christmas comes around, I want to talk about whether or not the Christmas story is real, or is it rooted in mythological ideas. So answering some of those challenges, I've heard a lot of people who say things like, your podcast, they go into such a deep level and yet without feeling weighed down, and it's inspiring me to dig on my own. And that's really the goal.
Yeah, and get people to become students once again. I see Mike Bird there. I see John Dixon, Peter Williams, Richard Bauckham, Daniel Wallace, John Lennox, Danny Hayes, a lot of friends of mine who've been on your podcast. And what you do there is really unique, and I just commend you. I want people to go find it and to listen to it because, again, the production value is fantastic. And you tell a wonderful story, and you dig into some very, very important places. You've got 63 episodes out there. How can people find you?
I'm online at humbleskeptic.com, but you can also just, go to your favorite podcast portal, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever, and type in Humble Skeptic, and you'll get me.
If people want to support what you're doing, I mean, there's a way to do that on your website too.
Yeah, humbleskeptic.com. There's a donate portal at the top and a whole bunch of different ways. But the thing is, it's just a labor of love. You study the scriptures and you find all this stuff that you just can't let it sit with you. You have to share it. And then I want to find a creative way to express it. So since I had a background in radio, I thought, my calling is less to the ivory tower and more to mediate that knowledge. So mediating knowledge in a well-produced medium. So that's kind of what I do.
Yeah. It's great. It's called The Humble Skeptic, and listen to Shane Rosenthal on a regular basis. I'm just delighted that we had a chance to meet recently. I look forward to having you back to the Lanier Theological Library in the future for maybe another lecture or another opportunity. Shane, thanks for being with us today on the Stone Chapel Podcast.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
Stand by for a nugget of wisdom from the Noble Skeptic. Don't let another day go by before you go to thehumbleskeptic.com and get to know Shane Rosenthal. He has a compelling story, as you've heard, and his motto resonates with me and probably with you as well. Truth isn't afraid of questions. The Stone Chapel Podcast is brought to you by the Lanier Theological Library and Learning Center in Houston, Texas. Thanks to my fantastic wife, Kathy Capes, for editing this podcast. Thanks to Phil Keggy for our music. Thanks as well to Jessica Mauser and Jenna Firestone for all their work behind the scenes at the Church Leaders Podcast Network. We hope these conversations incite curiosity and questions, but also faith and resolve. Until next time, I'm David Capes. Thanks for listening.
Proverbs 14:15 says, "The simple man believes everything, but the wise man gives thought to his steps." And to me, this means we shouldn't be gullible, but we should think about all the important things in life.